What if the first words ever written were never meant to record the beginning of civilization, but to warn us about its end? That thought hovers over the sands of southern Iraq, where the ghosts of cities like Uruk and Eridu whisper beneath the dust. Here, clay tablets lay buried for millennia, carved with wedge-shaped marks by hands that have long turned to dust. These tablets do not tell the story of a people discovering agriculture, building shelters, or learning to write. No, they describe something far stranger, a civilization that seemed to appear fully formed, as if remembering rather than inventing. And if that's true, then we must ask, what exactly were the Sumerians trying to remember? If you're drawn to the idea that buried beneath myth lies memory, and beneath ruins, revelation, then this is your kind of story. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more history that hides between the lines. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I like to imagine these ancient echoes traveling across time zones. And if you find yourself intrigued, if something in this story stirs your curiosity, share the video. It means you've heard the whisper behind the title, "What if Sumerian records reveal what happened before the Great Flood?" The discovery began in the late 19th century, when archaeologists digging in the ruins of Sumer expected to find the infancy of culture simple tools, rudimentary villages, primitive writing. What they unearthed instead challenged everything we thought we knew. In the soil near Uruk and Nippur, thousands of clay tablets emerged, not with hesitant scribbles, but with complex syntax, precise mathematics, and astronomical charts that match modern data. These weren't the confused ramblings of a newborn society. These were the detailed records of a people who already understood law, trade, medicine, and the stars. In short, they didn't seem like a beginning. They seemed like a continuation. Even the cities themselves defied expectations. Eridu, regarded as the oldest of them all, wasn't a random sprawl of huts. It was planned. It was aligned with the stars. Canals ran through it with engineered precision. Ziggurats rose from the desert in geometric defiance of the flat horizon, designed with knowledge of cardinal directions and celestial movements. The more archaeologists dug, the older and more refined the structures became. Rather than a steady progression from crude to complex, the layers suggested the opposite, a sophisticated past buried beneath the more primitive layers above. One tablet unearthed in Berlin carries an inscription that stops the heart with its simplicity. This is the restoration of what was before. That single word restoration overturns centuries of assumption. It does not suggest invention, it implies memory. It suggests that the Sumerians were not forging civilization from nothing, but piecing it back together from ruins left behind by a forgotten world. Perhaps their civilization did not emerge from the void. Perhaps it rose from the ashes of something older, something lost. And perhaps that older world was swept away by the flood they remembered so vividly in their myths. The fingerprints of ancient scribes still cling to some of the tablets. Imagine holding one, feeling the ridge of a finger that pressed into wet clay 6,000 years ago. That print is more than a smudge, it is a heartbeat. It is a moment frozen in time. A connection between the living and the long dead. And what did that hand record? Not merely grain rations or tax lists, but complex cycles of Venus, star charts, hymns to gods whose names still echo in religious texts across the world. In a time we are told was primitive, they tracked Jupiter and Mars with precision, performed calculations we didn't rediscover until the Greeks, and practiced medicine with herb lists and surgical instructions. How? Many tablets even record advanced mathematical formulas, some predating Pythagoras by over 1,000 years. These were not accidental discoveries. They imply sustained observation, teaching, application. They imply systems. Someone passed this knowledge down. Someone taught the Sumerians what to record, how to record it, and perhaps, most importantly, why. Because in those tablets, written in cuneiform with mechanical clarity, lies something that does not behave like the start of civilization. It behaves like a salvage operation. It reads like the notes of survivors trying to remember before it was all lost. And then there are the anomalies. Bronze tools in a time before the Bronze Age. Cylinder seals showing what appear to be machines' gears. Perhaps even engines etched onto clay by people supposedly living before such technology existed. And then there is the Baghdad battery, an object that could have generated electricity 2,000 years before the official timeline says such things were possible. Were these remnants of forgotten technology, or were they hints, clues left behind by those who knew more than they should have? Even more startling is the widespread nature of the stories. The Sumerians weren't alone in speaking of a great flood. The Akkadians had their version. So did the Hebrews. So did the Hindus. So did the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica, cultures separated by mountains, oceans, and millennia all remembered the same thing: a world drowned. A reset. A moment when everything was lost and had to be begun again. Could this shared memory be a coincidence? Or does memory drift like silt, settling in new lands, waiting to be remembered again? In the ruins of Uruk, archaeologists found not only towering walls and temples aligned with celestial bodies, but also a library, 40,000 tablets, catalogued with obsessive detail. Why such focus on documentation? Why this urgency to record everything from star positions to temple inventories? The answer may lie in the trauma of survival. Perhaps the Sumerians were not inventors, but archivists. Perhaps they knew that if the memory of the world before was not preserved, it would vanish completely. And perhaps the silence in their writing, the gaps, the hints, the spaces between the lines speaks not of ignorance, but of grief. The grief of what was lost. To understand the Sumerians, we must stop asking what they built and start asking what they rebuilt. Their base 60 number system still shapes our clocks. Their calendars still haunt our sense of time. Their myths mirror those told thousands of miles away, and their language isolated, alien, unconnected to anything that came before or after, stands as a riddle carved into the bones of history. It did not evolve. It appeared, complex and ready, like a tool sharpened before use. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small cylinder sits in quiet defiance. Its inscription once again repeats the phrase, "This is the restoration of what was before." Those who translated it paused. The word is too specific to be metaphor. It is not poetic flourish. It is testimony. These people knew they were rebuilding. They knew they stood on the ashes of something greater, and they were determined not to forget. So they carved it into clay, knowing clay endures where flesh does not. In that fragile space between invention and remembrance, between myth and history, something waits. The tablets, silent as they are, hum with purpose. And maybe that's why we keep returning to them. Not just for the data they hold, but for the feeling they evoke that we are not the first to wonder, not the first to record, and not the first to lose everything. That, in the dark before the light of history, someone else looked at the stars, remembered what had been, and whispered it into clay. The story of human development is often told as a slow, relentless progression. We are taught to see history as a gradual climb from the caves of prehistory to the gleaming towers of today. One invention builds upon another fire. The wheel, writing, cities, each step hard-earned. Each breakthrough the result of countless trials and errors. But Sumer does not fit this pattern. It appears in the archaeological record not like a sapling pushing through the soil, but like a tree already in full bloom. Branches heavy with fruit. And if this is true, then we are forced to confront an unsettling possibility, that Sumerian civilization was not an origin point, but a re-emergence. The earliest Sumerian cities did not grow slowly. They appear almost overnight, and when they do, they bring with them a startling array of technologies and concepts. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, each of these settlements demonstrates a level of planning and sophistication that stands in stark contrast to what we would expect from humanity's supposed first steps. Streets laid out in grids, houses with internal courtyards, complex drainage and sewage systems, centralized temples dominating skylines, all precisely oriented to cardinal directions and star positions. There was no fumbling in the dark. The light was already on. Their writing system, cuneiform, appears just as mysteriously. Scholars cannot point to a slow development from pictographs to phonetics. The system comes to us already refined, already capable of capturing lore, poetry, trade records, and cosmic philosophy. Its structure is dense, layered, and nuanced, nothing like the early attempts at communication one might expect. And its flexibility allowed it to be used not only for Sumerian, but also for later languages like Akkadian and Babylonian. That adaptability suggests a writing system not born of necessity, but of design. Someone built it to last. Linguistically, Sumerian itself remains an orphan. It belongs to no known language family. Attempts to link it to Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, or even Uralic languages have all failed. It simply exists, self-contained and self-referential, with no known ancestors or descendants. A language that arrives, functions with incredible precision, and then vanishes, only to be preserved through religious and scholarly use long after it ceased to be spoken. For linguists, this is more than a puzzle. It's a paradox. A language that does not evolve is not natural. It is curated. Even their understanding of agriculture reveals no learning curve. From the start, the Sumerians had irrigation systems, crop rotation schedules, and granaries capable of supporting large urban populations. Their texts list various grains, legumes, and fruits, and include instructions for managing water flow through canal systems that rival modern precision. This was not subsistence farming. This was industrial-level food production, engineered to sustain a civilization. And what of law? The Sumerians gave us some of the earliest legal codes, carved in stone, detailing contracts, property rights, marriage laws, and penalties for theft and violence. These were not vague moral statements. They were enforceable, detailed, and specific. Civilization depends on social order, and the Sumerians seem to understand this deeply. Their laws hint at a culture already familiar with urban problems, disputes over land, fraud, corruption, and already equipped with tools to resolve them. Where did this awareness come from, if they were truly the first? It is not just the physical evidence that raises eyebrows. It is the tone of their writing. When the Sumerians speak of their civilization, they do so not as inventors, but as restorers, over and over again. Their inscriptions say that kingship, law, and knowledge descended from heaven, not metaphorically, literally. They claim to be rebuilding what had come before. The gods, they said, handed them the tools of civilization, and whether one interprets the gods as divine beings, ancestral teachers, or memories of an older race, the message remains: we did not make this. We remembered it. Some scholars argue that perhaps this memory is collective, that after a long dark age, scattered tribes regrouped and rebuilt using remnants of forgotten knowledge, that the Sumerians were simply the first to write it down. But if this were true, we would expect inconsistency, fragmented systems, mismatched measurements, and incomplete records. Instead, we find unity. Base 6.0 mathematics runs through their calendars, trade systems, and astronomical models. Their star charts reflect knowledge that requires centuries of careful observation. Their architecture follows geometric patterns with religious and mathematical significance. This is not cultural drift. This is intentional design. And it's not just what the Sumerians knew, it's how early they knew it. The Plimpton 322 tablet contains a list of Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Their city-states were governed by councils and priests, with records showing voting procedures and public accountability. Their music used scales and instruments tuned with mathematical ratios. Their medical texts list over 200 plant-based treatments, and many of those same plants are still used in herbal medicine today. We see the fruits of civilization before we see the roots. How do we explain this? Some suggest lost cities precursors to Sumer washed away by time and water. Others propose that earlier hunter-gatherer groups passed on oral traditions that the Sumerians finally wrote down. But the scale and precision of what appears with Sumer goes beyond what could be passed through story alone. You don't memorize trigonometry. You don't accidentally build a city aligned with the solstice. These things require continuity, knowledge, and intention. Even the artistic record tells the same story. Cylinder seals, used like stamps to mark ownership or identity, are carved with incredible detail. Some depict celestial diagrams. Others show what appear to be advanced tools, machinery, or strange humanoid figures with objects that resemble breathing apparatus or flight suits. Are these simply artistic exaggerations? Perhaps. Or are they visual memories of a reality now lost? That possibility lingers uncomfortably at the edges of the archaeological narrative. And if we widen our lens to include other ancient sites, Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Egypt, the submerged ruins off the coasts of India and Japan, we start to see a pattern. Civilizations that should not exist by the accepted timeline. Monuments that defy technological explanation, and myths that speak of a world before our own. The Sumerians stand at the crossroads of these mysteries, not because they were the beginning, but because they were the first to try and remember the end. In every stone they laid and every tablet they inscribed, they left us clues not just about who they were, but about who came before them, their cities, their language, their mathematics, and their myths all point to a deeper truth, buried beneath the sands and beyond the limits of conventional history. That civilization, like memory, may not always begin at the beginning. Sometimes it begins in the aftermath, when survivors pick up the pieces and rebuild not from nothing, but from echoes. Beneath the dust of ancient Sumer lies more than clay and bone, it hides intention. The deeper archaeologists dug into the cities of Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and Ur. The more it became clear that these were not chaotic settlements born of necessity, but expressions of memory. Their streets, temples, and canals weren't just functional, they were symbolic. The cities of the Sumerians weren't merely built for survival. They were designed to remember. To trace their structure is to walk through an inherited blueprint. Geometry acting as language, architecture as testimony. Eridu, believed by the Sumerians to be the first city, was more than a cluster of mud brick homes. It was a sacred pattern layered over and over across millennia. Excavations revealed that the temple at Eridu was rebuilt again and again in the exact same place, directly atop its earlier foundations. This was not a cultural accident. It was ritualistic persistence. Each new temple didn't replace the old, it honored it, preserved its orientation, its alignment to the stars. The earliest layers date back nearly 8,000 years, and from the beginning, they show astronomical precision, geometric symmetry, and planned engineering. These weren't humble origins. They were echoes. The pattern continues in Ur. The great ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god, is the most famous structure. But it's the urban layout that speaks loudest. Streets arranged in grids, houses positioned with sky-facing courtyards to capture light and shadow in deliberate intervals, drainage systems running beneath the floors. This was not primitive. It was precise. Archaeologists noted that doorways, corners, and even the placement of windows followed patterns aligned to the heavens. The city seemed to reflect not just physical order, but celestial order. It was as though the Sumerians were imprinting the heavens onto the earth. Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, was no different. It held no king, but it held meaning. From Nippur radiated a network of cities spaced in intervals that corresponded to musical ratios, distances based on the same base 6-0 system the Sumerians used for time and angle. Scholars found that the positioning between cities like Eridu, and Lhasa wasn't arbitrary. It mimicked harmonic intervals 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 ratios used in tuning musical instruments. This was not mere coincidence. It suggested that the Sumerians saw harmony not just in sound, but in space, that cities were meant to resonate like notes in a chord, vibrating in balance with one another and with the cosmos. The base 6-0 system itself is a marvel. In a world that defaulted to base 1-0, the Sumerians chose a more elegant structure, one that allowed for easy division by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This wasn't a simple counting method, it was a framework that shaped time 60 seconds, 60 minutes, space 360 degrees, and trade, standardized weights and measures. The choice wasn't arbitrary, it was architectural. It allowed for the creation of calendars, astronomical models, and engineering blueprints that endured for thousands of years. It still defines our world today. We call it a system. They may have called it memory. Why base 6-0? Because it reflects cycles. 60 is the number of harmony, of periodicity. In astronomy, it allows for calculations of planetary orbits, lunar cycles, and the movement of constellations across the sky. The Sumerians didn't discover these things slowly. They began with them. Their earliest records show knowledge of the lunar year, of the solstices and equinoxes, of the Venus cycle. And this knowledge wasn't confined to scribes or priests, it was embedded in architecture, in city planning, in ritual. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were observatories. Their corners were aligned to solstice points, their platforms elevated for horizon viewing. At certain times of year, light would enter through narrow slits or doorways and illuminate sacred images. These were not primitive superstitions. They were engineered experiences, reminders of the sky's order mirrored on earth. The ziggurat of wasn't just a tower. It was a calendar, each level painted a different color, representing celestial spheres: black for Saturn, red for Mars, white for Jupiter, blue for Mercury, and so on. When the sun struck the structure, it moved like time through the colors of the cosmos. Even their irrigation systems reflect intelligence. Canals were dug, not where convenient, but where mathematically ideal. Water flowed at angles that optimized crop yield and prevented stagnation. The placement of fields followed seasonal patterns, not just of rain, but of lunar influence. They understood the gravitational pull of the moon long before Newton. They watched the stars, charted their motion, and responded with engineering. Civilization, to them, was not separate from the cosmos. It was a mirror of it. Modern researchers have attempted to explain these phenomena through trial and error, generations of trial leading to eventual mastery. But in Sumer, we see mastery first. We see knowledge without precedent. We see mathematics not just in ledgers, but in stone, the layout of cities, the proportions of temples, the spacing of windows, all adhere to ratios we associate with modern architectural principles. The golden ratio, pi, and harmonic division. Some have argued this was intuitive genius. But intuition doesn't build a city aligned to the solstice without instruments. It doesn't map Venus's cycle without generations of records, and it certainly doesn't spread across multiple cities unless it is taught. The more we examine their world, the less it looks like a beginning. It looks like a schematic, a deliberate act of remembrance made physical. Geometry becomes the medium of memory. Stone, the archive of ideas too sacred to leave to oral tradition alone. Writing may have recorded laws and myths, but architecture preserved the structure of the world. Each angle, each ratio, each shadow cast by a ziggurat stairwell was a line in a silent poem dedicated to the world before. What kind of people encode their past in math? Survivors? People who know the danger of forgetting. People who've watched a world drown and know that spoken words dissolve in floodwaters, but numbers endure. Geometry persists. Stone resists time more stubbornly than sound, and so they built not to invent civilization, but to remember it, not to reach for the stars, but to recreate the pattern they once saw reflected in them. Every street in Ur, every canal in Eridu, every foundation stone in Nippur was laid, not just with mortar, but with meaning. They were rebuilding, carefully, precisely, so they would not forget again. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as creators. Their texts say it plainly: kingship descended from heaven. Knowledge was given. Civilization was not invented, it was restored. And their cities, so carefully arranged, so achingly perfect in their resonance with the sky, are not monuments to human pride. They are blueprints of memory geometry used not to control nature, but to remember it. Because, to the Sumerians, forgetting was the real catastrophe. The flood may have taken the world, but silence could take its meaning. And so they carved that meaning into the very shape of their lives. Among all the mysteries left behind by the Sumerians, none is as unsettling as their language. Cities can be rebuilt. Temples can be copied. Mathematics can be rediscovered. But language leaves fingerprints that are almost impossible to erase. It carries ancestry, evolution, mistakes, and borrowings. It reveals who learned from whom, and Sumerian reveals nothing. It stands alone, linguistically orphaned, disconnected from every known family of human speech. It does not slowly emerge from simpler forms. It appears in the historical record already complete, complex, and self-assured, as if it had been preserved somewhere and then released fully formed into the world. Linguists have spent more than a century trying to trace Sumerian back to something older. They have compared it exhaustively to Indo-European languages, to Semitic tongues like Akkadian and Hebrew, to Dravidian languages of India, to Uralic and Altaic families, even to Basque, another linguistic isolate. Every attempt ends the same way. No connection, no parent language, no siblings. Sumerian does not sit on the family tree of human speech. It stands beside it, like a fossil from a different evolutionary line. This alone would be strange, but what makes it more troubling is that Sumerian was already highly sophisticated when it first appears. Its grammar is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning through stacked suffixes added to a root word. This allows for extreme precision. A single verb can encode subject, object, tense, mood, direction, and intent. It is not the kind of system that emerges accidentally. It requires abstraction, planning, and long refinement. Yet there is no evidence of earlier, cruder stages. There is no Proto-Sumerian. There is no linguistic childhood. The language enters history as an adult. The writing system mirrors this strangeness. Cuneiform begins as a system capable of recording everything from poetry to planetary motion. Each sign can represent a sound, a word, or an idea depending on context. The system is flexible but controlled, symbolic but precise. It is not an alphabet groping toward meaning. It is a tool designed for memory. Early tablets already show standardized signs, consistent grammar, and specialized vocabulary for law, medicine, astronomy, and ritual. These are not the records of people inventing writing. They are the records of people using it confidently. Even more revealing is how the Sumerians themselves understood their language. They did not claim to have invented it. They believed writing was a gift from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge and accounting, whose name translates as she who counts the stars. Literacy, to the Sumerians, was not a social skill. It was a sacred inheritance. To write was to preserve cosmic order. Scribes were trained in temple schools where memorization, recitation, and precision were paramount. Writing errors were not just mistakes, they were violations of order. The Sumerians called their language Gir, often translated as the noble tongue or princely language. This was not a casual name. It implies elevation, authority, and antiquity. Sumerian was not simply how people spoke, it was how the gods spoke. Even after Sumerian ceased to be used in daily life, it remained the language of ritual and scholarship for nearly 2,000 years. Akkadian replaced it as a spoken tongue, but Sumerian continued to be taught, copied, and recited, much like Latin in medieval Europe, a dead language, kept alive because it carried something irreplaceable. Why preserve a language no one speaks unless it holds memory that cannot be translated? The answer may lie in how Sumerian encodes meaning. Scholars studying Sumerian hymns notice something unexpected. The structure of the verses follows mathematical ratios, the number of syllables per line, the repetition of sounds, the spacing of phrases align with harmonic intervals used in music, ratios like 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5 appear repeatedly. These are the same ratios that define consonant musical harmony and architectural proportion. Language, music, and mathematics were not separate domains. They were expressions of a single system. This suggests that Sumerian was more than a spoken language. It was a code, a way of aligning sound with number and number with meaning. To speak correctly was to resonate with cosmic order. To write was to fix that resonance into matter. The Sumerians believed the universe itself was structured by harmony, by vibration, by balance. The word they used for divine principles, me, carried connotations of law, function, and utterance. The gods did not merely command reality, they spoke it into being, and the me were the words that shaped the world. If this sounds abstract, consider the implications. A language designed to mirror cosmic ratios would not evolve easily. It would not borrow freely from neighboring tongues. It would resist change. It would need to be preserved exactly as received. This may explain why Sumerian appears suddenly and remains frozen in form for centuries. It was not meant to evolve. It was meant to endure. There is a haunting parallel in later traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a brief but profound statement. Before the scattering of humanity, the whole earth was of one language and one speech. One language, one system, one way of encoding reality. The Sumerians never explicitly claimed their language was the first, but they treated it as foundational, as though it carried remnants of a pre-flood tongue, a language spoken when the world was unified, before catastrophe, fractured memory, and scattered people across the earth. Perhaps the flood did more than drown cities. Perhaps it shattered language itself. Survivors would have carried fragments of speech, regional variations, simplified systems adapted for survival. But a sacred core might have been preserved, taught only to scribes, written only in clay, protected from corruption. That core could be Sumerian, not invented after the flood, but salvaged from before it. This would explain why the language feels alien, why it resists classification, why it encodes mathematics and music in its structure, why it was preserved long after it ceased to be spoken. It was not just a means of communication, it was a vessel of memory, a linguistic relic of a world that no longer existed. When Sumerian finally fell silent as a living tongue, something vanished with it. A way of thinking, a way of structuring reality, a bridge between sound, number, and meaning that no later language fully recovered. The Greeks would speak of logos, the Hebrews of the word, but the Sumerians had already known this. They had lived in a world where language was not arbitrary, where speech aligned with the cosmos, where writing was an act of preservation rather than invention. Today, Sumerian tablets sit behind glass in museums, their wedge-shaped marks, silent but intact. We can translate them, we can analyze their grammar, but we cannot hear them as they were meant to be heard. We cannot feel the resonance they once carried. The language has become a fossil, and like all fossils, it tells us not just what existed, but what was lost. A language without parents does not arise by accident. It is either the first of its kind, or the last survivor of something older. And when the Sumerians pressed their words into clay, they may have been doing more than recording history. They may have been trying to save the last echo of a unified world before it faded completely into silence. To claim that the Sumerians inherited knowledge from an earlier forgotten world is bold, but when we examine the contents of their tablets, not the myths or hymns, but the raw data, the calculations, the charts, the precise records of celestial cycles and mathematical formulas, it becomes difficult to dismiss such a claim. What we find is not the fumbling curiosity of a civilization just learning to observe its surroundings. What we find is something far more unsettling: mastery, the kind of knowledge that requires not just intelligence, but time. Lots of time, generations of accumulated observation, tools we do not believe they possessed. And yet, the evidence sits in clay, silent but exact. Start with astronomy. One tablet, discovered among the ruins of Nippur and catalogued as VAT 4956, records the synodic cycle of Venus with startling precision: 584 days. The exact number modern science confirms using advanced telescopes and orbital mechanics. The Sumerians did not have telescopes. They had clay, styluses, and patience, or so we're told. And yet they tracked Venus's cycle with such accuracy that their data aligns with computer models thousands of years later. This is not something one guesses. It requires long-term data collection and a systematic method for recording observations. Who taught them to do this? How did they even begin? The same question applies to their knowledge of Jupiter and Mars. Other tablets record their movement across the sky, year after year, noting retrograde motion and orbital changes. The Sumerians even understood the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axial rotation that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. The Greeks didn't chart it until much later. The Renaissance astronomers of Europe only confirmed it with the aid of instruments, so how could a people 5,000 years ago, supposedly just emerging from the Neolithic era, have known it? Mathematics offers another layer of the mystery. The Sumerians used a base 60 system sexagesimal, a framework still embedded in our measurement of time and geometry. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why 60? Because it is divisible by so many numbers. It allows for fractions and harmonics that base 10 does not. But base 60 is not intuitive. It must be taught. And from the beginning, the Sumerians used it with confidence. Their multiplication tables, division problems, and advanced calculations were recorded without hesitation. They solved quadratic equations, used square roots, and applied geometric progressions. One tablet, known as Plimpton 322, lists sets of numbers we now recognize as Pythagorean triples. It predates Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years, and these weren't just abstract puzzles. The Sumerians applied this math. They used it in land measurement, construction, astronomy, and trade. Their tablets include formulas for calculating area, volume, and interest rates. They understood compound growth. They calculated the dimensions of trapezoids, triangles, and cylinders. Their engineers built levees, walls, canals, all based on mathematical principles that should have taken centuries to evolve. But in Sumer, they appear at the start. Even their understanding of medicine was advanced. Medical texts list symptoms, diagnoses, and prescriptions for a range of conditions. Some show an understanding of anatomy that suggests dissection. Others offer remedies based on dozens of plant compounds, some of which modern science confirms as effective. One tablet outlines procedures for cleaning wounds, applying antiseptics, and even performing rudimentary surgery. These were not folk remedies passed down by word of mouth. They were catalogued, standardized, and taught in temple schools. We must ask again, how does this level of sophistication appear so suddenly? The historical record offers no earlier civilization from which the Sumerians could have borrowed. There is no precursor, no gradual development, no messy experimentation. The data, the precision, the application all point to a system inherited whole, and the Sumerians themselves claimed this over and over again. They wrote that their knowledge came from the gods, from above, from those who descended and taught them. Whether one believes in divine beings or not, the message is clear. The Sumerians believed their knowledge was not their own. Their word for this knowledge was me, translated variously as divine decree, sacred order, or functional essence. The me were not merely ideas or commandments. They were codes, blueprints, archetypes of civilization. Each me governed a domain law: music, metalwork, language, agriculture, kingship. They were said to be kept by Enki, god of the waters and wisdom, who passed them to humanity either by gift or by theft. In one story, Inanna, goddess of love and war, steals the me from Enki while he is drunk and brings them to Uruk, sparking the beginning of urban life. Myth, perhaps, but the symbolism is unmistakable. Knowledge was not invented, it was transferred. Even the tools they used raise questions. In the ruins of Uruk and Eridu, archaeologists found bronze implements crafted with such precision that they rival later artifacts from the peak of the Bronze Age. Yet these date centuries earlier. The standard narrative says metallurgy evolved slowly, through generations of trial and error, as people learned to control fire, mix ores, and perfect alloys. But Sumerian bronze shows no learning curve. It is already optimized, already effective. As if someone gave them the recipe, cylinder seals depict scenes that include what appear to be mechanical devices, wheels, pulleys, even complex looms. Some seals show individuals operating objects that resemble modern tools or instruments. Are these artistic flourishes? Or are they visual memories of tools once known and now lost? The images are too specific to be dismissed as abstract symbolism. They hint at a technological understanding that does not match the supposed timeline of history. Then there is the enigma of the Baghdad battery. Discovered in the 20th century, this artifact includes a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. When filled with vinegar or wine, it produces a small electric charge, dating to around 250 BCE. It is centuries too early for electrochemistry, yet it works. Some researchers believe it may have been used for electroplating gold onto jewelry. Others argue it had ritual significance, but its construction suggests intent, not accident. Someone knew how to make it. Someone remembered. This memory, this faint thread of impossible knowledge, runs through every Sumerian discovery. It is as if they began where others ended, as if they woke from a long sleep with fragments of something older still lingering in their minds. Their civilization did not rise. It resurfaced. And the knowledge it carried was not developed, it was recovered. How do we respond to this? Dismiss it as coincidence? Say they were lucky? That seems inadequate. To deny the implications is to ignore the evidence. To accept them challenges everything we think we know about the past. But perhaps the answer lies not in absolutes, but in humility. Perhaps the Sumerians were exactly what they said they were: restorers, survivors, scribes of a knowledge not born in their time, but remembered from a time long buried beneath the flood. In every ancient culture, the flood story echoes with chilling familiarity. It comes with different names, different gods, different survivors, but always the same core: a great deluge, a judgment, a destruction of the old world. In Sumer, That story was not myth. It was memory, pressed into clay thousands of years before the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Vedic texts of India. The Sumerian account of the flood is dry, concise, and shockingly matter-of-fact. Then the flood swept over, just 5 words. No divine poetry, no moral allegory, just a line drawn through history. A boundary that separated 2 worlds, the world before and the world after. Archaeological evidence suggests that this wasn't just literary invention. In the 1,920 seconds, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Beneath the ruins of homes and temples, his team uncovered an 8-foot deep layer of clean, sterile silt. No artifacts, no tools, no human presence, just mud smooth, uniform, laid down by water. Beneath that, charred walls, pottery, and bones. A burned city. Above the silt, new construction, new temples, a new beginning. This wasn't the aftermath of a battle. It was a reset, a flood so total that it silenced time. Woolley's discovery was not isolated. The same sterile band appears in other cities, Shuruppak, Kish, and Lagash, each showing a layer of sudden destruction followed by a cultural restart. The dating varies slightly, some around 2900 BCE, others slightly earlier, but the pattern holds. A civilization interrupted, a memory burned into the soil, and always following the mud. A remarkable return. New construction, new writing, new rituals. As if the survivors had waited for the water to recede, then began again. In the Sumerian version of the story, the survivor is Ziusudra. His name means life of long days, or he who found life. The gods, weary of the noise and chaos of humanity, had decided to erase their creation. But one god, Enki, lord of wisdom, and the deep waters disagreed. He whispered to Ziusudra through a wall of reeds, warning him of what was coming. Build a boat, seal it with pitch. Bring with you the seed of all living things, animals, craftsmen, scribes, musicians, healers, the bearers of memory. The instruction was not just to preserve life, but to preserve knowledge. When the rains came, they did not stop. For 7 days and 7 nights, the waters rose. The boat was tossed like driftwood on an ocean of chaos. Then, silence. The world below was gone. When the flood receded, Ziusudra sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven did not return. It had found land, and Ziusudra disembarked. He offered a sacrifice to the gods. They smelled the smoke and came down. Enlil, furious that someone had survived, was calmed by Enki's defense. Wisdom should not perish with the wicked. Ziusudra was granted immortality not as a reward, but as a burden. He became a living memory, a keeper of what had been lost. This structure is echoed almost exactly in the Akkadian tale of Atrahasis, the Babylonian epic of Utnapishtim, and the Hebrew story of Noah. In each, a righteous man is warned. In each, a vessel is built. In each, animals and humans are preserved. The flood is global. The destruction is total. The survivors are few. The knowledge is sacred. And the pattern is too consistent, too geographically widespread to be explained by coincidence. Across continents and millennia, the same story survives. So either humanity has a collective imagination unusually obsessed with water, or we are all remembering the same event. Geology offers support. Core samples from the Black Sea reveal a catastrophic flood around 7,500 years ago, when melting glaciers caused the Mediterranean to surge through the Bosporus Strait, inundating what had once been fertile lowlands. In a matter of weeks, a vast inhabited region vanished beneath the rising sea. Archaeologists suggests that this event may have been remembered by countless generations, mutating into legend as people scattered. Other studies point to the end of the last ice age between 12 and 10,000 years ago, when rising temperatures triggered a series of violent sea level rises, glacial lake outbursts, and coastal collapses. The Earth changed rapidly. Civilizations living near the shore would have seen the ocean claim their homes. And yet, in the Sumerian record, the flood is not an end. It is a transition. The Sumerians divided time into before the flood and after the flood. Their king list, a document listing the rulers of Sumer, begins with a startling line. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists 8 kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. Their reigns are counted in units called sars, periods of 3,600 years. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200. Then, abruptly, the flood swept over. Is the stream. After the flood, the kingship continues. But now the reigns are shorter. Hundreds of years. Then decades. Then lifespans we recognize. The impossible collapses into the believable. The mythic gives way to the mortal. But the style of the text does not change. The tone is the same. The script is the same. The bureaucratic voice continues unbroken. To the Sumerians, both periods were real. The flood was not allegory. It was the line that divided worlds. Some scholars suggest the long reigns of the antediluvian kings are symbolic, meant to convey grandeur or divine favor. Others propose astronomical meanings, pointing out that the reigns are all neat multiples of 3,600. Still, others suggest that these kings were not individuals at all, but symbols of epochs, keepers of knowledge tied to celestial cycles. But regardless of interpretation, the Sumerians themselves took them seriously. The king list was copied and recopied across centuries, treated not as legend but as record. Not one version edits the numbers. The flood remains the dividing line, not just of history, but of reality. What does this mean? That time itself changed after the flood, that the laws of life, of birth, death, and memory were altered by catastrophe? Perhaps not literally, but culturally, emotionally, spiritually it seems they were. The flood broke something, not just land, but continuity. Before it, kings reigned for eternities. After it, humanity became fragile, time became short, memory became sacred. The Sumerians knew this. That is why they wrote everything down. That is why they catalogued the heavens, the herbs, the laws, the rituals. They weren't preserving their discoveries. They were preserving fragments of a vanished world. Their obsession with documentation wasn't pride. It was fear. The fear of losing what had already been lost once before. And so the flood remains not just in myth, not just in geology, but in the very shape of our oldest stories. It is the rupture we all remember, the moment when the gods withdrew, when the knowledge that once descended from heaven was scattered among survivors, entrusted to human hands. The Sumerians believed they had received that trust, and their tablets, pressed into clay and buried beneath temples and cities, still whisper that sacred memory. There exists a single tablet that forces even the most skeptical scholars to pause. It is not elaborate or ornate. It contains no poetic flourishes or mythological exaggerations. It is written in the same careful script the Sumerians used for accounting records and trade receipts, and yet, what it records reads like something from the pages of fantasy, a list of kings who ruled the world for tens of thousands of years. This is the Sumerian king list, one of the most controversial and compelling documents of the ancient world, not because of what it says, but because of how seriously it was taken by those who wrote it. It begins with a line as simple as it is profound: after the kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu. That phrase, descended from heaven, is not metaphorical in the original Sumerian. It is a statement of origin. Kingship, they believed, was not invented. It was bestowed from above. From there, the tablet begins listing kings, Alulim of Eridu, who reigned for 28,800 years, Alalgar, 36,000 years, Enmenluana, 43,200. In total, 8 kings are listed before the flood. Together, they ruled for 241,200 years. Then, with chilling finality, a single line, then the flood swept over. Hebros. After the flood, the list resumes with more familiar reign lengths, hundreds of years, then decades, then years. It records kings from cities that have been excavated and verified: Kish, Uruk, Lagash. The transition from mythic time to historical time happens without any stylistic change. The Sumerians made no distinction. They recorded it all as one continuous chronology, and they copied it obsessively. Versions of the king list have been found in Nippur, Lhasa, and Isin, each one treating the list as a record, not a fable. Why would a civilization so meticulous about math, trade, and astronomy invent such impossible numbers? Some scholars claim the pre-flood reigns are exaggerated to elevate ancient rulers to divine status. Others propose scribal error, a centuries-long accumulation of zeros. But the list is too consistent. The numbers are too deliberate. Each pre-flood reign is a perfect multiple of 3600, a number the Sumerians called a sar. In their cosmology, a sar wasn't just a large number. It represented a complete celestial cycle. These were not just years. They were epochs. Consider this. Alulim's 28,800 years equals exactly 8 sars. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 sars. Enmenluana's reign of 43,200 equals 12 sars. The pattern is clear. These reigns are not lifespans. They are cosmological markers. If true, then the king list is not just political history, it is astronomical coding, a calendar written in the form of genealogy. What kind of civilization tracks time in 3,600-year cycles? The answer leads us back to the sky. In ancient Mesopotamia, celestial motion was everything. The stars were clocks. The gods themselves were mapped in constellations. If kingship truly descended from heaven, then perhaps these kings weren't rulers in the human sense, but symbols, representatives of entire eras, defined by celestial alignment. The king list would then function as a map of the deep past, a record of time measured not by human life, but by the movement of the cosmos. This interpretation becomes even more compelling when we realize that many of the cities listed in the king list, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are real. Their ruins have been unearthed, their existence confirmed. These were not imagined cities. They were built, destroyed, and rebuilt across millennia. Shuruppak is especially important. It is associated with Ziushudra, the Sumerian Noah, the man who survived the flood. Archaeological layers in Shuruppak confirm a sudden flood event around 2900 BCE, followed by renewed habitation. So the king list aligns with both archaeology and myth. That alone is rare, but its deeper mystery lies in the way it portrays the flood as a reset, a break in time. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns, cosmic order, kings who ruled as if time obeyed different laws. After the flood, decay, mortality, the narrowing of history into human scale. The implication is clear: something changed. Time itself became shorter. Reigns collapsed from thousands of years to a single lifetime. Civilization went from grandeur to fragility, and the Sumerians knew this. They saw themselves as heirs to a broken legacy. The king list was not a celebration of progress. It was a eulogy, a record of what had been lost. By preserving the names of the pre-flood kings, they were preserving memory itself. They did not alter the numbers to make them more believable. To do so would have been sacrilege. because the purpose of the list was not to impress, it was to remember. This reverence is especially striking given the bureaucratic tone of the tablet. It reads like an inventory, not a poem. The same hands that tallied grain and counted taxes also copied these impossible rains. There is no distinction in tone, only in scale. This suggests that the Sumerians did not see a contradiction between the mythic and the practical. To them, the king list was as factual as a ledger. The kings before the flood were real, even if their lifespans defied comprehension. Why is this so hard for us to accept? Because it doesn't fit the model. Civilizations are supposed to begin small and grow. Kings are supposed to rule for decades, not millennia. But what if the Sumerians weren't inventing history? What if they were restoring it? What if the flood did not erase fiction, but fact? The king list then becomes a survival artifact, a memory compressed into numbers, preserved in clay so it wouldn't vanish completely. To read it today is to feel the weight of time, not linear time, but deep time, the kind of time that blurs the line between myth and reality. It forces us to confront a possibility we are trained to reject, that an advanced world may have existed before ours, that it ended in catastrophe, and that its final survivors, scribes, kings, priests, carried forward its memory, not as myth, but as record. When you run your fingers over the wedge-shaped marks on the king list tablet, you're not just touching history, you're touching grief, the grief of a civilization that remembered too much and feared forgetting even more. They recorded the impossible not to convince us, but to remind themselves, because they had already lived through the silence that comes after the flood, and they understood something we're only just beginning to suspect, that memory is fragile, and time, once broken, cannot be repaired. When the Sumerians spoke of gods, they did so differently than later civilizations. Their gods did not reside on remote mountaintops or in abstract heavens. The Anunnaki, the beings who descended from the sky, were not distant, omnipotent creators. They were present, described with startling specificity. They had names, roles, locations, and family lineages. They taught agriculture, irrigation, metallurgy, medicine. They governed cities. They passed down the divine laws known as the Me, and most importantly, they interacted directly with humanity. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not mythic figures. They were remembered ones. The name Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came. This was not symbolic in Sumerian writing. It was recorded with the same gravity as temple construction dates and trade records. These were the teachers, the lawgivers, the architects of civilization. And while later myths would elevate gods into unreachable realms, the earliest Sumerian records portray the Anunnaki as beings who walked among men, lived in designated cities, ruled from temples, and withdrew only after the flood changed the world. Enki was one of the most important, god of water, wisdom, and creation. He resided in Eridu, the first city. His domain was the Abzu, the fresh water beneath the earth. But Enki was more than a deity. He was the guardian of knowledge. He held the Me, the codes of civilization, and chose to share them with humankind. It was Enki who warned Ziushudra of the flood. It was Enki who, in some accounts, created humanity itself, shaping them from clay, mixing them with divine essence, and breathing life into them. The intent was clear. Humanity was made not as an accident, but as a solution. One of the oldest surviving Sumerian texts, the Atrahasis epic, describes the Anunnaki laboring to build the cities of the gods. But the work was hard. They rebelled. The solution proposed by Enki and the goddess Ninhursag was radical. Create a being that could carry the burden, a helper, made of earth and the flesh of a god. Clay was mixed with blood, divine material, and shaped into form. A being part heaven, part earth, mortal, but intelligent. Created not just to survive, but to serve. This was not poetry. It reads eerily like genetic engineering, a union of two distinct materials, biological and informational, resulting in life. To modernize, the story seems impossible, but its structure is familiar. The mixing of divine and mortal, the breath of life, the shaping of man from clay. It appears again in later traditions, the Hebrew Genesis, the Egyptian Khnum, the Greek Prometheus. All echo the same idea, that humanity was shaped, not born, taught, not self-taught, created for a purpose, not by chance, and in the Sumerian case, that purpose was clear civilization. Enlil, another prominent figure, was the god of air and authority. If Enki was the architect, Enlil was the governor. He issued decrees, established order, enforced law. His temple in Nippur was the Dur and Ki, the bond between heaven and earth. It was said that without Enlil's blessing, no king could rule legitimately, and when humanity grew too noisy, too chaotic, it was Enlil who demanded the flood. His was the will that ended the world. But even he, after the flood, granted kingship, once again, suggesting that the divine plan, though interrupted, was not abandoned. Then there was Anu, god of the heavens, father of the Anunnaki. His temple in Uruk aligned with celestial movements. He rarely interfered, but his presence was foundational. His name meant sky. He represented the unreachable source, the divine origin. And perhaps that's the point. The Anunnaki were not gods in the later religious sense. They were beings whose nature was beyond human, but whose actions were recorded as real. They had homes, they had temples, they had rules, and, most importantly, they had memory. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and transformation, stands out as one of the most complex. Her myths are deeply symbolic, but also historical. She rules Uruk. She descends into the underworld. She returns. In one tale, she travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the Mi. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, bringing music, writing, kingship, warfare, everything that makes a city a civilization. The symbolism is striking. Knowledge stolen, transferred, activated. Civilization begins not with invention, but with recovery. Are the Anunnaki gods? Aliens? Survivors of an earlier world? Interpretations vary. In the 1972nd, author Zecharia Sitchin proposed a radical theory that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in search of resources, genetically engineered humanity as a labor force, and left behind fragments of their presence in myth and architecture. Mainstream scholars rejected this theory, citing a lack of direct evidence, but even they admit the Sumerian descriptions are strange. The Anunnaki are described as radiant, winged, descending in flames. Their temples are aligned with stars. Their symbols include rockets, stars, and strange machines. Cylinder seals from Uruk and Kish show winged figures holding pinecone-like objects, standing before trees of life, flanked by strange devices. Some seals appear to depict solar systems, central stars surrounded by planets. One famous seal, the 243, shows a sun with 11 orbiting bodies, including one that appears beyond Pluto. Is it symbolic? Perhaps. But again, the precision is unsettling. These images, these stories, these rituals, they all suggest that the Sumerians were not imagining. They were remembering. They described beings who taught them how to plant, how to irrigate, how to record, how to live together. They did not claim to invent anything. They claimed to receive everything, and in return, they built temples, sang hymns, and recorded laws. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude. Even if the Anunnaki were not literal visitors, their impact is clear. They represent the transfer of knowledge from a source older, wiser, and more advanced. Whether that source was a pre-flood civilization, a group of survivors, or something more cosmic is less important than what it implies, that humanity's rise was not a solo ascent, but a guided one. And when the flood came, and the Anunnaki withdrew, humanity was left not alone, but entrusted with memory, with order, with the tools to rebuild. The age of direct contact ended, but the legacy remained. The divine codes, were now in human hands, and the Sumerians took that responsibility seriously. They built cities not to glorify themselves, but to honor the teachers who had come before. They preserved their names, their temples, their lessons, because they knew what forgetting looked like. They had seen it happen once, and they were determined that it would not happen again, long after the flood. After the gods had withdrawn and the world had quieted into recovery, the people of Sumer looked to the skies and remembered, not with longing alone, but with intent. They built towers massive, tiered structures of mud, brick, and bitumen that rose from the plains of Mesopotamia like staircases arrested in ascent. These were the ziggurats, the most visible monuments to an invisible loss. To modernize, they appear as temples, but to the Sumerians, they were more than places of worship. They were bridges, landing places, anchors for a connection that had once been real and now lay broken. Each ziggurat was a cosmic model, a layered reflection of the heavens rendered in architecture. Their levels were symbolic: the underworld, the earth, the sky, and the realms beyond. At the summit stood a small shrine, open to the stars, prepared not for priests, but for beings greater than men. A couch, a table, food and drink offerings laid for visitors who no longer came. These chambers were not symbolic gestures, they were invitations. The Sumerians were not just honoring memory, they were attempting reconnection. The greatest of these towers stood in Babylon, called Etemenanki. It meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was massive, rising nearly 300 feet, with 7 ascending levels. Each one painted a different color corresponding to celestial spheres: black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, gold for the Sun, silver for the Moon. It was a model of the visible universe, encoded in stone. To climb it was to move through layers of reality. To reach the top was to stand at the meeting point between the mortal and the divine. But this tower, like others, eventually became misunderstood. In the Hebrew Bible, the story is retold as the Tower of Babel. Humanity, speaking a single language, attempts to build a structure that reaches heaven. God, displeased, scatters them and confuses their tongues. The tower is left incomplete. The lesson, as often told, is about pride, but this interpretation may miss the point. In the Sumerian worldview, the tower was not an act of arrogance. It was an act of desperation, a longing to restore what had been severed, a prayer made of brick and geometry. The confusion of languages that followed this too is mirrored in Sumerian belief. They spoke of a time when the gods and humans shared a tongue, when knowledge could be passed without distortion, when the divine decrees, were understood. After the flood, that clarity was gone. Language fragmented, memory fractured. The original speech, the noble tongue, the emigre, became the language of ritual alone, preserved in tablets, recited by scribes, but no longer spoken freely. The ziggurats, then, were built not to reach heaven in rebellion, but to call heaven back. Their design supports this interpretation. Ziggurats were not just high, they were precise, oriented to the cardinal directions, aligned with solstices and equinoxes, designed with proportions found in music and mathematics. Their steps echoed harmonic ratios. Their summits faced constellations. They were more than buildings. They were instruments-tuned structures meant to resonate with cosmic forces, and the Sumerians believed that if they built correctly, perhaps those who once descended would descend again. But they did not. The gods did not return. The chambers remained empty. The towers stood, proud but silent. Over time, the rituals continued, but the purpose faded. The priesthood remembered the words, but not their meaning. The songs were sung, but the stars no longer answered. Eventually, the ziggurats became symbols, then relics, then ruins. Yet the architecture remains. Even today, the ziggurat at Ur stands partially restored, its massive steps rising above the desert like a staircase for forgotten gods. Tourists walk where priests once climbed. They look out over a landscape that has forgotten its builders, and they see only bricks. But those bricks once held purpose. They were arranged to reflect a structure deeper than stone, a cosmology made solid. And what of Etemenanke, the Tower of Babylon? It was still standing when Herodotus visited in the 5th century BCE. He described its size with awe, though by then it was already fading. Later, Alexander the Great ordered its restoration, but he died before the project could be completed. The tower was abandoned, and by the time of the Islamic Golden Age, it had crumbled entirely. Today, little remains, but the story survives, not just in scripture, but in the shape of pyramids, spires, and domes across the world, all echoes of that first, desperate attempt to remember. The ziggurats were not failures, they were reminders. Their silence was not proof of divine absence, but of the depth of human yearning. In their layered construction, the Sumerians encoded a truth we often forget, that civilization is not built from ambition alone, but from loss. The towers rose because something once came down, and the builders remembered, even in their decline. The ziggurats influenced the sacred architecture of every culture that followed. The pyramids of Egypt, the step temples of Mesoamerica, the pagodas of Asia, the tiered shrines of the Himalayas, all rise in layers, all point to the heavens, all carry the same question: what lies above? And perhaps, more hauntingly, who used to come down? Today, the sky is still silent, but the structures remain. Their bricks endure, and beneath them, buried in foundations and foundations of foundations, the first layers still sit, aligned, geometric, remembering, waiting. The Sumerians did not build to dominate the sky. They built to make it remember them. And in that, they succeeded. Their towers whisper through time, not in thunder, but in quiet persistence, a silent testimony carved in dust and sun-baked clay. If you stand beneath the ruins at dusk, when the stars begin to emerge and the wind skims low across the desert, you can almost feel it, the aching geometry of longing, the structure of memory turned to stone. And though no voice answers, the question remains, embedded in every tier of every ziggurat that still reaches upward: will they ever return? If civilization were truly born in Sumer, one would expect a record of struggle, of failed attempts, of gradual understanding, of incomplete forms slowly coalescing into coherent systems. But what we find is something far stranger. The records of the Sumerians are not chaotic or confused. They are meticulous, systematic, and impossibly advanced. The earliest tablets are not experiments. They are conclusions. The technology is already practical. The math is already accurate. The star charts are already aligned. It's as if they began at the end, using knowledge that had been rescued from somewhere else and pressed into clay before it could vanish again. These clay tablets, their humble medium, belies their extraordinary content. They record everything: the movement of stars, the formulas for alloying metals, the proper ratios for architectural construction, prescriptions for medicine, legal codes, hymns, and prayers. But within these records, there is a tone of urgency, a need to remember, not just facts, but principles, not just instructions, but meaning. It is the tone of a people who knew how easily knowledge could be lost. Consider Plimpton, 322. A small clay tablet containing a list of Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It was made over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, but the tablet does not explain the theorem. It does not define it. It simply applies it, as if the users already understood the principle deeply enough to skip the foundations. Other tablets show calculations for square roots and compound interest, using methods nearly identical to modern mathematical algorithms. These are not primitive minds groping toward enlightenment. These are trained minds applying inherited systems. In metallurgy, too, we see signs of sudden mastery. Bronze tools have been found in Sumerian layers dated earlier than the conventional start of the Bronze Age. Their casting is precise. The ratios of copper to tin are optimal. There is no gradual development of alloying techniques, no messy learning curve. It simply appears the knowledge of fire, metal, and chemistry is there from the beginning, as if someone had passed the formula along. Even the so-called Baghdad battery, discovered thousands of years later in the ruins of a Mesopotamian site, hints at forgotten technologies. A small ceramic jar with a copper cylinder and iron rod, capable of generating a weak electric current when filled with an acidic liquid. Some researchers believe it was used for electroplating, while others dismiss it as coincidental. But the design is deliberate. It has all the components of a galvanic cell, and its purpose, if practical, suggests an understanding of electricity that predates our standard timeline by 2 millennia. The visual record is just as haunting. Cylinder seals from Uruk and other cities depict figures operating devices that resemble machinery. Wheels, pulleys, and levers. Stylized images of what appear to be drills or spindles. Some even show strange, winged beings standing before trees, surrounded by symbols that resemble star systems or circuits. These could be metaphor, of course, artistic flourishes. But when taken alongside the precision of their other work, the consistency of these symbols begins to feel intentional. And then there are the me, those mysterious codes of civilization. In Sumerian myth, the me are not rules. They are archetypes. There is a me for kingship, for music, for metalwork, for language, for love, for justice, for each function of society. They are described not as concepts invented by people, but as elements of the divine structure of reality. They were kept by Enki in the Abzu, and given or stolen by Inanna to bring civilization to Uruk. The story reads like a myth, but underneath, it suggests something deeper, that civilization is a code, that each function of society has a design. That knowledge, real knowledge, is not discovered, it is accessed. In modern times, we think of progress as linear, but the Sumerians seem to understand it differently. For them, progress was not ascent, it was remembrance. They did not see themselves as innovators. They saw themselves as restorers. Their cities were not creative expressions. They were reconstructions. Each ziggurat, each tablet, each line of cuneiform was a thread, pulling them back toward a past they feared losing forever. Why else write so much? Why else preserve a dead language for 2,000 years? Sumerian stopped being spoken around 2000 BCE, but scribes continued to learn it, copy it, and recite it in temple schools. It was used in religious texts, scholarly works, and ceremonial inscriptions. It became the language of memory. The guardians of this knowledge knew that to lose the words was to lose the structure. The me had to be preserved, not just in ritual, but in rhythm, in the ratios of music, in the geometry of buildings, in the cycle of festivals. And they were right to fear forgetting. Every civilization eventually falls. Every archive burns. Every tower crumbles. What endures is what was encoded well enough to survive the silence. Stone and clay outlast speech. Geometry outlasts metaphor. When the flood comes not just of water, but of war, of decay, of time, it is the coded knowledge that survives. The Sumerians built their memory into form, into brick, into math, into myth. Their tablets are now spread across the world, in museums and universities. Many have not yet been translated. Thousands more sit in storage, uncatalogued, unread, but each one is a potential spark, an echo from a mind that lived 5,000 years ago, trying to preserve something too precious to be forgotten. They are not just texts, they are acts of survival. If we listen, truly listen, we might hear what they were trying to preserve. A worldview in which the universe is not random, but structured, in which knowledge is sacred, because it is fragile, in which language is not invention, but inheritance, in which remembering is the highest duty of civilization, and forgetting is the greatest tragedy. The Sumerians did not claim to be the first. They claimed to be the ones who came after, the ones who rebuilt, who recorded, who preserved, and perhaps that is why their legacy endures, not because they began civilization, but because they tried to save it. And in the echo of their tablets, we can still hear the warning. Knowledge can be lost, even to time, even to us. When we sift through the remnants of Sumer, what we find is not the invention of civilization, but its recovery. The evidence is not subtle. It is carved into stone, pressed into clay, embedded in the very geometry of the cities and temples they left behind. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as pioneers. They called themselves restorers, time and again. Their inscriptions declare it. This is the restoration of what was before. They did not claim to have created knowledge. They claimed to have received it from the gods, from the heavens, from a world that no longer existed. The flood was their dividing line. In the king list, it separates the impossibly long reigns of antediluvian kings from the more familiar lengths of post-flood rulers. It marks the boundary between two worlds, the old one, where knowledge descended from above, and kings reigned for 3,600 years at a time, and the new one, in which humanity had to learn again, step by step, how to measure, build, heal, and remember. But even in the new world, the Sumerians refused to forget the old, and that refusal is why their legacy has endured. The Sumerians wrote more than any other ancient civilization of their time. They recorded not just names and dates, but systems, philosophies, patterns. They encoded mathematics into the proportions of their temples. They embedded harmonic ratios in their music. They aligned their buildings to the stars not for beauty, but for memory. Their civilization was not ornamental, it was mnemonic. Every structure, every sign, every ritual was designed to carry memory across generations. Their city-states Uruk, Eridu, Nippur were built on ruins that were already ancient by the time of Abraham, and in each layer we find evidence of deliberate continuity. Temples rebuilt on top of older temples, aligned to the same celestial points, rituals maintained for centuries, sacred language preserved even after it was no longer spoken. In modern times, we call this tradition. But for the Sumerians, it was survival. To forget was not an option. They had already lived through one forgetting. They would not allow another. We see their awareness of loss not just in their writings, but in their silence, in the lines they left blank, in the words they repeated, in the overwhelming sense of mourning that hovers between the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. They were haunted by what came before, not in fear, but in reverence. They saw themselves as caretakers of something vast and fragile, a knowledge that had once been whole and now survived only in fragments. And so they copied, and recopied, and recited, and rebuilt. And what were they trying to preserve? Not just techniques and formulas. though they preserved plenty of those. But something deeper, a worldview, a model of the universe in which everything was connected: sky, earth, water, time, music, mathematics, language, law. The me, those sacred decrees or codes, were not separate from reality. They were reality. Each me defined a function: kingship, craftsmanship, justice, even sexual love. Together, they described the architecture of existence. And the Sumerians believed that to lose the me was to lose the blueprint of civilization itself. That belief may explain why their influence stretches so far. Why echoes of Sumer appear in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in Mesoamerica. Why the flood story surfaces in nearly every ancient culture. Why star charts from opposite sides of the globe resemble one another. If the survivors of a global cataclysm scattered, each carrying fragments of what had been lost, then the scattered pieces would look different, but resonate with the same structure, not because they copied each other, but because they all remembered the same original. And that idea that civilizations are not born, but rebuilt, carries unsettling implications for us. It suggests that we are not the first, that history is not a straight line, but a cycle, that our technological advances may be rediscoveries rather than inventions, that even our greatest breakthroughs may echo whispers from an earlier age. The Sumerians understood this. They pressed it into clay for us to find. The geological record supports them. Beneath the cities of ancient Mesopotamia lie flood layers, sterile bands of silt with no human remains. No pottery, no ash, just silence. Above them, cities reappear, full of order and knowledge. Beneath them, a burned world. The Black Sea, once a freshwater lake, was violently flooded by seawater around 7,500 years ago, wiping out coastal settlements. Sea levels worldwide rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Whole regions were submerged, whole histories erased, and what survived? Clay tablets, stone monuments, memory, preserved by those who refuse to forget. Other sites: Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Yonaguni off the coast of Japan, Dwarka beneath the Arabian Sea, challenge our understanding of history. Monolithic architecture dated to periods when humans were supposedly primitive, cities beneath the waves, aligned to solstices and star clusters. These are not myths. They are measurable facts. They do not tell us everything, but they point in a direction the Sumerians already knew. What they left behind is more than evidence. It is warning, a message buried in bricks and stars and words. That knowledge, once lost, takes millennia to recover. That floods come not only with water, but with time, war, and forgetfulness. That every civilization rises with the assumption that it is the first and falls without realizing it was the last of something older. They knew this. That is why they built with durability in mind. That is why they used clay, not parchment. Why they carved into stone, not just memory. They understood that their world could fall again. And they wanted someone, somewhere, in some future age, to find what remained and understand. To begin again, not from nothing, but from fragments. Perhaps that someone is us. Perhaps we are standing at the same threshold they once stood upon, looking backward, remembering what was, and forward, fearing what may come. Climate collapse? Technological dependence, systemic fragility. We too live in an age of towering knowledge and crumbling foundations. And if we are not careful, the next flood of fire, of failure, of forgetting may wash away more than we realize. But we have their warning, pressed into clay, whispering across time. This is the restoration of what was before. That phrase is not just about the past. It is an instruction for the future. To preserve, to encode, to remember, because when the flood comes again, and it always comes, it will be those who remember who rebuild, not from scratch, but from the fragments from the echoes, from the clay.